Tashikale, and welcome to another episode of Tibet Talks. I'm Denji Gyatso, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for this special session with our ICT leadership team. Joining us today, we have our ICT leaders from Brussels, Berlin, and Washington to speak with you to answer questions on our work and issues related to Tibet. For our viewers, I'd like to offer just a brief background. ICT office in Washington, D.C. was set up in 1988 after the historic visit of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Washington, D.C. in 1987, when he presented his 5-point peace plan at the United States Congress. Guided by the vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the ICT leadership have worked strategically and effectively for over 3 decades with elected leaders and citizens throughout the world to provide political and humanitarian support for Tibetans. ICT Europe was established in 1999 and ICT Germany in 2002. With that, joining us today to answer your questions and update you on ICT's work are our leaders from Washington, D.C., from Berlin, and from Brussels. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much.
So to begin, I'd just like to give a brief introduction for our viewers. As audience, many of them have seen your faces and your names, but not quite familiar with your background. So I'll begin with Bhuchung. Bhuchung is interim president at ICT based in Washington, D.C. He joined ICT in 1995. He has a background in journalism, and he previously worked as a reporter for the Daily Indian Express newspaper in New Delhi before joining the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala, India, in 1984. He has served in the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, as well as the Office of Tibet in Switzerland. He was a member of the Task Force on Negotiations set up by the CTA and a member of the team for talks with the Chinese leadership between 2002 and 2010. Welcome, Bhuchung. Actually, we were supposed to have Tsering Jampa as our guest, but she could not join us as planned. Tsering is usually based in Amsterdam and serves as Executive Director of ICT Europe since its inception in 1999. But in our place, we are joined today by Vincent Metten. Vincent is EU Policy Director from our office in Brussels, which was set up in September 2006 and aims to interact with European institutions. Vincent has been in Brussels with us since 2007. Previously, he has experience as National Detached Expert of the Belgian Ministry for Defence to the European Commission, as well as having worked as coordinator for security and defence issues at the Space Policy Unit and for the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you very much.
And lastly, we have Kai Mueller from our Berlin office. Kai is based there in Berlin and has been serving as Executive Director of ICT Germany since 2005. Before joining ICT, Kai served on the board of Amnesty International Germany and also worked as a research associate in the German Parliament. Since 2015, he has also coordinated ICT's United Nations initiatives. So Kai is a trained jurist focusing on international law. He holds a master's degree in political science, sociology, and African studies. Apart from international advocacy, Kai has organized support for the Tibetan children's villages in India. So welcome to Kai. And with that, for our viewers watching this live session, we'll be taking your questions for our speakers. So please post questions on the comment section of our Facebook live stream, or you can also email them to us at comments@safetibet.org. With that, I think we would like to begin by asking each of you if you could give a brief overview of the political climate for Tibet in your respective countries, and maybe also touch on some key actions or programs that your offices are currently working on. And I'll turn it over to Bhuchung first, and then Vincent, and then Kai, please. Bhuchung.
Thank you very much, Tenchula, and thank you for this opportunity for ICT as a whole to sort of inform the general public about what we do in our different offices. As you said, since 1988, ICT, when it first began here in Washington, D.C., we had the fundamental objective of supporting the vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and of the Tibetan people. So that vision has been carried through all these decades, and we continue to base ourselves on that. Within that includes two broad objectives. One is to support a political resolution to the Tibetan issue through dialogue, which His Holiness and the Tibetan leadership would like to achieve. And secondly, in the meanwhile, to enable, to promote and protect the Tibetan people's cultural, religious, and spiritual heritage through different programmatic support that we get. Our support has been overall through the office of the Special Envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which was led by Mr. Lodi Gyari for many years. And he was based here in Washington, D.C. in our office, and through that we were able to render that support in concrete terms. So we have been trying to achieve these objectives through a few initiatives. One of the first of which is to institutionalize support for Tibet in the government. We started here in Washington, D.C. through working with the United States Congress and the administration. And today we can say now that fundamental American policies on Tibet are institutionalized in the form of different legislations. Secondly, through programmatic support right since the late 80s until now, and it continues every year, Congress appropriates several $1 million for helping the Tibetan people, both in Tibet and in exile. And we as ICT look at that as one of our annual work with the Congress to sort of encourage members of Congress to continue to support the Tibetan people in these programmatic initiatives. Thirdly, since late 90s, United States and now even in Europe has begun to have a sizable Tibetan population who have eventually attained the citizenship of their countries. And we have been using that power of citizenship to encourage Tibetan empowerment here so that the Tibetan Americans can be part of the political process of the United States. This includes Tibetan Youth Leadership Program. This includes Tibetan Lobby Day. Actually, next week we will have this year's Lobby Day, although it will be virtual, on September 28 and 29. And we already have had sizable registrations from the different Tibetan associations and the Tibetan supporters here in the United States. Now, all these are aimed at having a policy, proactive policy by the Biden administration here. And that leads me to the political status of the situation of Tibet here in the United States currently. Currently, the Biden administration has, through legislative mandates, the obligation to work on promoting dialogue for Tibet, has also the legislative mandate to support the Tibetan people in different ways to encourage their religious freedom, spiritual heritage, and more importantly, through the most recent Tibetan Policy and Support Act, to ensure that on the issue of Tibetan religious freedom as it pertains to the issue of Tibetan rights to selection of reincarnation process, the United States position that it is only His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhist community who have the mandate and who have the authority. That has to be ensured by the United States. And we are currently working with the Congress and with the administration to see that the Biden administration follows up on these mandates, as well as on the commitments made by then presidential candidate Joe Biden in September of 2020, in which he said that promoting dialogue on Tibet will be one of his priorities, and working with His Holiness the Dalai Lama will be part of that priorities. So currently the Biden administration has a policy on China that says that will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Now, that within that policy framework, we would like to see that the Biden administration be proactive on Tibet. And right now, there is no special coordinator for Tibet issues who has been designated in the State Department. We hope that the Biden administration will do it soon. President Biden himself has committed to appointing the special coordinator, and we hope that once the special coordinator is in place, the Biden administration will be proactive in encouraging dialogue on Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhuchung. Turn over to Vincent. Please go ahead, Vincent.
Thank you, Tenshu, and I'm happy to be with my colleagues here today in this discussion. I will give some, I will address the EU-China relation and how Tibet and human rights, the space given to our issue in this relationship. With three remarks. The first one is that Europe here, it's not a monolithic bloc. There are 27 member states. They have different political sensitivities and approaches toward China. Some countries are more sensitive to human rights. For instance, the former communist countries of Eastern Europe. And this is certainly allies for us. We see also that some countries like Greece or Hungary have closer link to Beijing, essentially because of economic ties, and sometimes are blocking EU statement at the Human Rights Council session. So there is a lack of unity and coherency when it comes on sensitive issues in China, like Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Xinjiang. China is also using a divide and rule strategy here. For instance, you have a group that is called the 17+1 cooperation group, which became recently the 16+1 because Lithuania decided to exit this group. And it's composed of some EU countries, not all of them, but I think it's not very useful for this European unity. And also when there are tensions between China and the EU, for instance, China is going to national capitals, for instance, to invite ambassadors or diplomats based in Beijing to visit Xinjiang or Tibet. That's my first point. The second point is that Tibet is raised in bilateral relations, mostly in human rights or political dialogues. So in general, when a country has a human rights dialogue with China, which is the case for some of them, it's a few of them like Germany, the Netherlands, the EU, but also Switzerland and the UK for Europe. Tibet is normally always on the agenda, including between when you have EU-China human rights dialogue, you have some individual cases of prisoners that are raised, including Tibetan cases that we also contribute to, for instance. When sometimes the problem is that some European countries are hiding behind this EU-China dialogue not to raise human rights, saying, oh, there is a EU-China dialogue so on human rights, so that's where issues are discussed, and so that's a little bit unfortunate. It should be also raised at a bilateral level. In some countries, you also have human rights ambassadors, like in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the EU, which is a good thing. I think it should be expanded also. In the EU, for instance, this role is devoted or fulfilled by the Special Representative for Human Rights, who is Mr. Gilmore. His predecessor, Mr. Lambrinidis, has been to Tibet in 2013, and we have also contributed in terms of briefing and information before the visit. And we hope that the current High Representative, Special Representative, will also pay a visit there. And my third point for this introductory remarks is that parliaments in the national countries, but also at the EU level, are playing a very important role on human rights. In the front line, they are, more outspoken than governments when it comes to human rights or Tibet. And there are also in some countries so-called Tibet intergroup, so platforms of discussion with members from different political parties who discuss Tibet or take action, like in Czech Republic, that's the biggest group with more than 50 members. The 3 Baltic countries, also France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and 3 countries outside the EU, Switzerland, UK, and Scotland. There is also the Tibet intergroup in the European Parliament, who plays an important role. And I would say that in Brussels, the Parliament of the European Union is very important because it adopts, sometimes a report or a resolution on China and human rights issue or on Tibet. And this year, let me quote that there have been a resolution on Hong Kong after the implementation of the national security law. And also, recently there has been a new report on EU-China strategy. And this report, which has been issued a few days ago, I would even say, denounces the coercive labor programs in Tibet and also Chinese interferences in the selection of religious leaders. So that's an important message towards other EU institutions and towards China. And this report also says that the EU-China agreement on investment will not be implemented until Chinese sanctions on European officials are lifted. And these sanctions, who target also members of the European Parliament, are a reaction to the EU sanctions that were adopted against 4 Chinese leaders, officials, because of their role in the repression against Uyghurs. So I would say that today the EU is less naive than it used to be in the past. China is simultaneously depicted as a cooperation partner, but also as an economic competitor and as a systemic rival. And this is a new expression, I think, that has irritated very much Beijing. So this gives you an overview of where we are, and I'm happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for that update. And then I'll turn over to Kai, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tenshu, for being able to speak to you tonight. Good evening from Berlin, guten Abend from Berlin here in Germany. Very happy to speak to you. If we speak about Germany, much of what my colleague Vincent has been mentioning is also applicable, relevant. And my colleagues mentioned already a number of important issues and, in that respect, initiatives that ICT undertakes on that level. I would like to speak on a more general level about 2 things here. As Tenshu already said, ICT Germany is particularly active at the United Nations level. It's probably not wrong to say the United Nations is not doing enough on human rights and particularly on that. But for ICT and for many others, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, for example, is one of the few international fora where we can make Tibetan voices heard, their stories and oftentimes really gruesome experiences. Just recently, 4 independent United Nations experts have raised serious concern with regard to the cases of 2 Tibetans, Rinchen Sotrim and Go Sherab Gyatso. Both are Buddhist monks, and they have been in detention for more than a year now, while it is not really exactly clear where and why. Both have exposed themselves either in Chinese social media or through their writings, and it is clear that the authorities did not like what they saw and read. These cases are just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm afraid since independent information from Tibet rarely reaches the outside world. It is encouraging, therefore, that these UN experts have taken up these cases, made them public, and put out some public requests towards the Chinese government to request more information about the whereabouts, about the reasons for their detention. As said, these are just 2 cases, 2 cases of so many we hear. And this is exactly what we aim to achieve. We want to address human rights bodies, independent expert at the United Nations level to take up these cases, ultimately, of course, to reach a improvement in the situation of those who are detained or those who are disappeared. And what struck me recently in particular was the case of one Tibetan, a Tibetan businessman named Dorje Tashi, who's serving a life sentence in Lhasa. He got detained in 2008 and went through an ordeal of torture and ill treatment during his pre-trial detention. ICT got his testimony, and we're now actively working towards governments and human rights experts so they raise his case with the Chinese government. As said, I could talk about so many more Tibetans, women and men alike, young and old. It is, from my view and from our view, extremely important, therefore, to hold the Communist Party accountable for their violation of international law. And that is, of course, relevant at the United Nations level, because that's what's the reality on the ground. I feel that international law is an important point of reference, since also, as many of you have also monitored, seen over the past years, months, and so forth, what is the case? The CCP somewhat successfully misleads the international public in portraying Tibet in terms of what allegedly constitutes social and economic progress. To my personal concern, there's a lot of buy-in into this internationally. At the same time, it is oftentimes ignored that Tibetans have no access to justice, as there is no independent judiciary, courts are governed by the Communist Party, there's no independent media, no civil society, and there are no independent labor unions. And moreover, China has neither ratified the International Covenant on Civil Rights, nor conventions of the International Labour Organization on forced labor and other essential instruments of human rights protection. So for me, the pivotal question is, can Tibetans seek legal redress against measures of the state, such as relocation measures, or against recruitment into so-called vocational training programs? Can they hope for independent investigations into allegations of torture, into arbitrary detentions? These kind of questions must be an integral part of any assessment of state measures in Tibet, and this is what we are conveying in our United Nations related work in Geneva and at other places. If I can just conclude as someone speaking from Berlin, as a German, and some may call this city a gateway to Eastern Europe. So I would like to recall the experience of life under authoritarian rule of the people who had lived under Soviet ideology in Eastern Europe. I feel that Western societies still lack understanding of what it means to be object of ideological transformation, of cultural assimilation, and far-reaching social projects of a one-party state. Many in Eastern Europe do understand, and it's quite logical, as my colleague Vincent Matten mentioned, that there is a lot of support for Tibet in the Baltics, in Poland, and the Czech Republic, and other places. They do understand the paternalism of an authoritarian state and know what this means for the individual, as it constitutes the exact opposite to self-determination. And this is what Tibet is about, self-determination of a people and of the individual. Perhaps a bit as a motivational closing here from my side, as a German, I would dare to say that, as with our country some 30 years ago, the winds of change may come quickly and unexpectedly. And that is an encouraging experience I like to share with our Tibetan friends and also with you out there. Thank you, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Kai. Thank you, all of you. You raised some very important points there. So I'll go to our audience questions. We have also a number of questions that ICT members have emailed to us. So I'll be going through those. And for viewers watching, please do know we'll take your questions that you post online here. So my colleagues are looking out for your questions. First question I may direct to Bhuchung. It, I think, follows up on Kai's statement also about the situation, how it is for Tibetans inside Tibet. Terry Baker, this is a Facebook question from Terry. She says, it seems that China continues to escalate their oppression of Tibetans and all minorities in their country. Are there any movements within the country that are working for human rights, or is China effectively suppressing all dissension? So maybe you could explain how the situation is for Tibetans.
Unfortunately, the situation in Tibet is such that the very assertion of Tibetan identity itself has become some sort of criminal action, and therefore there's very little space for Tibetans inside Tibet to assert their rights. Even having said that, in recent times, what we have seen is Tibetan people inside Tibet are using whatever options available for them to talk about their situation. We have been seeing that in the language advocacy rights, for example, where the Tibetan people are dissatisfied with the Chinese authorities' imposition of Mandarin as the dominant language of communication for the Tibetan people. China's own rules guarantee that people like the Tibetans can and have the legal right to use and to learn their language and use their language as the first language of communication. Unfortunately, that seems to be changing, and therefore there is some effort. Other than that, on the fundamental human rights issues, unfortunately, leave alone being able to assert themselves, the Tibetans in Tibet are not even able to communicate these to the outside world. So unlike, for example, even in the case of the Uyghurs, where they're able to get information from East Turkestan, as they call Xinjiang. From Tibet, if we can recall the self-immolations that took place, oftentimes we would get those information late, after days have passed, and that's because the Chinese authorities have clamped down heavily on the Tibetan people.
Thank you, Bhuchung. And my next question I have for Vincent. This is also a question that came to us via email. It says, the ICT and the Tibet movement have campaigned for the appointment of a EU special coordinator for Tibet over a decade, but we have not seen an outcome yet. What real commitments and messages are you getting from EU countries? Should we change tactics, and if so, what and how? This question comes from Tsering Jampa from London.
Thank you. Indeed, and ICT was also among those who asked to have a special coordinator for Tibet in the past. We've been lobbying for that, but we a little bit stopped doing so when a special representative for human rights was appointed, because we saw that this person would be responsible for human rights worldwide, and we felt that there was no willingness on the EU side and member states to appoint a special coordinator for Tibet anymore, saying, well, you have this person, he has the mandate for Tibetans, for Uyghurs, for all the also ethnic groups in China. So I think that's this position is very important, and as I mentioned in the introduction, Mr. Lambridinis was the first special representative to visit Tibet in his official capacity. I think he did a good visit on the ground, but it was not followed by very concrete outcomes, and there was nothing concrete actions that was taken by the EU afterwards. So I think this is something that should, I think the current special representative for human rights, Mr. Gilmore, should also visit Tibet and ask to access the region. And this is also the position of the EU, that there must be an access for foreign leaders and diplomats to the region. And so we invite him to go there and see what he can see with his eyes, and also prepare correctly the visit. I think that's an important request from us.
Thank you, Vincent. Now I have a question for Kai. Kai, this question is regarding the COP26, and the question is, what is ICT doing regarding the upcoming COP26 climate conference in Glasgow and the issue of climate change in Tibet? And jointly tagging on there, we have another question, a Facebook question on that same topic, asking what kind of joint collaborative efforts, lobby, activism do you see or recommend for Tibet support groups, NGOs, and the CTA to take up with regard to Tibetan environment and climate change?
Yeah, thank you. COP26 is of course a very relevant occasion for the international climate movement, and I would always suggest not to just merely look at this very conference, COP26, which is the culmination of discussion rounds, of meetings that have happened already before in this very context of the climate convention. So actually what should be considered is being, of course, somewhat present at the COP26 as Tibet groups to raise our flags. But at the COP26, there's not going to be a discussion about country-specific issues. So this is an opportunity of raising the Tibetan flag, if you will, and to create connections, to also create more awareness about the Tibet issue and the relevance of climate change, environmental problems on the Tibetan plateau and also beyond the Tibetan plateau in the Himalayan area. So actually, instead of just merely looking at one specific conference where so many issues are going to be discussed and in a very controversial way they're going to be discussed, the Tibet movement should look at a long-term strategy to address these issues and to find ways to educate the larger public from the Tibetan experience. And I'd say this is perhaps one of the most important things that the Tibet movement has to share with the larger public. The Tibetan experience with, for example, the lack of involvement of local communities when it comes to so-called environmental or climate protection projects, in this case implemented through the Chinese state, which are anything but participatory, which are anything but inclusive, and which are anything but respectful for Tibetan rights. So the Tibetan experience needs to be introduced into the international arena because it is an important experience, not just for Tibetans and their supporters, but also for perhaps the region of Asia, but maybe also beyond. We're looking at what it means actually, what are feasible and effective ways to protect the climate, and this cannot be done without the really active involvement of local communities. With regard to corporations, I would say it is important to look at also other stakeholders who are also suffering from climate change, but also stakeholders who are in a somewhat similar situation. And here again, I'm thinking of local communities, of what others call so-called minority situation and rights. We know Tibetans are not a minority in their own country, and this is a strategic approach that should be sought. Just thinking beyond the Tibet world, making the case for Tibet by offering added value for others. And I think it is indeed a valuable experience, a negative experience as such when it comes to Tibetan rights and results on the plateau, but it is a valuable experience that can be shared.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kai. With that, I'll go to a question emailed from one of our members in Netherlands. And the question is, do you have any idea where the Panchen Lama Gindu Chögyinima might be? Yeah, I'll go to Bhuchung for that.
Unfortunately, we don't have any information. ICT was among the first of Tibetan advocacy organizations taking up the case of the Panchen Lama when he was detained in 1995. And we were successful eventually in having some information given to the United Nations about the Panchen Lama. The Chinese have since been adopting the same sort of position, namely that he is fine, his family, and he doesn't want it to be disturbed. So that is what the Chinese authorities have revealed so far. But on the issue of the Panchen Lama, what is important is that even under Chinese laws, he is an adult and he can speak for himself. And if he or his family so desires to remain private, they should be free to say that themselves, rather than the Chinese communities Chinese government trying to speak on their behalf. And that makes us particularly, leave alone the political aspect of it, as religious followers, us people we are concerned whether he may still be living or not. So therefore, that is the situation on the Panchen Lama.
Thank you, Bhuchung. And then next question, maybe Vincent, you could tackle it. It says it's regard the recent disregard of Hong Kong's autonomy, which was guaranteed in the UK-China joint declaration, has attracted global attention. Overwhelming majorities of Hong Kong people are now keen to oppose the CCP regime. Those who fled Hong Kong are regrouping in Western countries to fight back. Taiwan is believed to be the next target under President Xi Jinping's leadership. What opportunities do you see for the Tibet movement in forming a stronger, more well-coordinated alliance with other stakeholders, including Chinese overseas democracy advocates and dissidents? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I think that there are, in a way, we are all on the same boat. I mean, all the people from Hong Kong, in the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Chinese dissidents abroad are all want the same. It's to have a democratic country where they can, travel safely, where they can express themselves, where they can gather, and so on. So I think it's we have all the same objective, is to fight and to the Chinese communist regime rules, policies. Of course, we also have then different sensibility, different approaches. I mean, Tibet movement and Uyghurs have the same goals, but have different ways to do it. There are local specificities. But of course, when there should be alliance and coalition, and this is something we are doing in Brussels with the Uyghurs and with the Taiwanese also, when we can, and representative of Hong Kong as well. We do joint protest on a regular basis when there are, EU-China summits or important anniversaries. So we always have been reaching out to each other to join forces. And I think that when we are together, we are our messages are stronger also. When I was in Taiwan also, I saw there was a lot of support for Tibet there, a lot of people that were sensitive to what is happening for Tibetan people. Of course, they are in a difficult situation now with Chinese leadership looking, and Xi Jinping looking at the island also, and trying to reunite it with mainland China. So it's a very serious concerns also. And so I hope it will not escalate, and that Beijing will, not go too far there. But I think that the answer is yes, we have to be together and unite when possible.
Kai, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would just like to resonate and underscore what Vincent has just mentioned. I think my experience over the past 3 or 4 years has been as such that there has been more cooperation with Hong Kong activists, with Uyghurs, with others who are really affected by this more assertive, more aggressive CCP policies in the People's Republic. And I find that quite encouraging, actually, because more often there's common ground, despite differences. Of course, the situations are different, but I think there is a greater awareness, and this also resonates with civil society, for example, here in Germany, which has been more alert in terms of CCP influence operations, if you will, in a whole array of areas. In education, academia, in media, in business, in newspapers, and so forth. So there's much more public interest. Of course, this is a result of a more aggressive diplomacy of the CCP here in the West, but also of civil society activism, and I'm really quite encouraged by the fact that also we, as a part of the Tibet movement, are playing a role in this, and we always try to support and wherever we can such initiatives, and I'm quite glad about this.
Tagging on to your comments there, Kai, how can the Tibetan movement be more coordinated in tackling this? We have another question on a member from Netherlands asking about writing opinion pieces for newspapers and letters to editors, and he says that the general Dutch audience knows very little about the situation for Tibetans in Tibet, and that Tibet is occupied and a colonized country, and what can be done. So maybe you could address that as well, Kai.
Yes, it's of course a very important question. I think in times of social media and the internet, I think it's one logical step to express views or to sort of inform or forward information about events, development in Tibet on that channel. But I understand not everybody prefers being around in social media. So newspapers still play an important role in our public awareness building. So I'd say it's always worthwhile to approach newspapers, because they live also from readers' interaction. So anyway, just regardless what is a viable avenue for just a normal person on the street or whoever who is interested, it should be pursued. I would encourage everybody to reach out to stakeholders that are within their reach, so to speak. So I'd say it is with regard to information about what is known about Tibet, it is in fact a serious problem, because we do have the information lockdown from Tibet. That means no independent reporting can take place from Tibet. If journalists or diplomats and whoever can enter the TAR, for example, Tibet Autonomous Region, it's a scripted tour and nobody is able to speak freely. That is not unfettered access. Needs to be clear. At the same time, the Chinese government has really beefed up its propaganda machinery. They really switched it up a notch, if one can put it like that, and they're trying really in a strategic way to influence the larger public here. And we know that particularly Tibet is relevant to them, because they are very frequently they represent Tibet as a success story in terms of social economic development. Closer look, may give a different image and picture of what is actually going on the ground. But we find that it's a danger for the larger public. The information, the influence operation of the CCP here in the West, but again, there's more awareness here in the West about what is going on. We as ICT here in Germany, and also I think in Belgium and in France, have been writing to newspapers whenever there was a so-called advertorial which has been placed by the Communist Party in some respected newspapers. This happens more often, unfortunately, but we find that public pressure helps, and that some newspapers, media and information channels here in the West are becoming more aware of the issues that are connected to such advertorials, to such information spreading.
Thank you, Kai. And then with that, we have another issue coming up, and this question is about the Beijing Olympics. So he said, the question is, around the time of 2008 Beijing Olympics, the Chinese government imposed a major crackdown in Tibet. With the Olympics returning to Beijing in a few months, do we need to worry about another crackdown? Also, how can we use the Olympics to pressure the Chinese government to stop its repression in Tibet? Maybe Bhuchung, you could take that.
Yeah, I think that our experience shows that the Chinese government will take every and any opportunity they can to strengthen their control over the Tibetan people. So as we speak, there have been detentions in eastern Tibet, where an ICT had issued a statement about our concern at those detentions and how these may be part of China's own longer strategy to sinicize the Tibetan people, so that the very identity of the Tibetan people no longer is there. So in terms of the Olympics, which is coming up in a couple of months now, we feel that the Chinese authorities are using the Olympics as a way to show a glorified image of China. And we don't want the international community to accept that without questioning China's abuse in Tibet. And that is the position we have. Whether or not they may crack down on Tibet prior to the Olympics, it's less likely that they'll do it because of the Olympics, but it could be more to fulfill their long-term strategy.
Thank you, Bhuchung. Next question, maybe I pass to Vincent. Vincent, the question is, last year, the United States passed the Tibet Policy and Support Act, stating only the Dalai Lama and Tibet Buddhist community can decide on his succession. European leaders have expressed similar beliefs. What more can be done to protect His Holiness's succession from China's interference? And in connection with that, there's another question that says, do you think EU leaders will push for similar law such as the United States Tibetan Policy and Act that also speaks to the succession of the Dalai Lama? Is this a focus for ICT offices in Europe? And what can the public do to support it? So maybe Kai, you can add in also after Vincent. Thanks.
It's a key issue, of course, for the future of Tibet. We have been working, ICT, all our office, to really have to push member states and governments to take a public stand on it, saying, that it's important that Tibetans themselves, the Buddhist community and His Holiness, decide the future of succession of leaders, of religious leaders. So far in Europe, there have been several governments who have taken such a stand, as in Germany, in Belgium, the Netherlands, and also in the EU. The High Representative, Mr. Borrell, answered to a parliamentarian question where he said it's up to Tibetan Buddhist community to decide about their future leaders. But it's only, I would say, a reaction to a question. I think it would be very important that there should be a statement on behalf of all member states saying the same. So that's very, I think, so there is still way to go and more to be done by the EU member states. Can there be a law in Europe? I mean, the way EU function is very different than in the US with all these aggregated member states. So I don't think we can have a law as such, but I think we should have certainly statements, proactive statements, and also, I mean, we could think about there is an EU now a sanction regime for violation of human rights or human rights serious abuses. This could be also the position of ICT is to be used in case of interferences against the succession of His Holiness. I don't think that today it will be used as such, but if in the future serious things develop, I think this should be considered by the EU. Just a remark on the Olympics that you raised before, the European Parliament has also made a clear stand that the EU leaders and national leaders should decline invitation to attend the Winter Olympics in Beijing until there is progress of human rights in the countries in Hong Kong. So I think that's we applaud this official position by European Parliament, which is not yet the position of the EU, who is assessing the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. I have a next question for Bhuchung. We'll check in with Kai afterwards. Bhuchung, this question is from London, Tsering Jampa, and it says, Western allies led by US are getting closer and closer to confronting China. The quadrilateral security dialogue between the US, India, Japan, Australia is seen as a major strategic development to confront China in the Indo-Pacific region. And the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal with Australia, UK, and US is another recent example seen as complementing the Quad. And at a time when the CTA in Dharamsala is seeking dialogue with the central leadership in Beijing, with the goal of achieving genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people, how do you read this new development vis-a-vis Tibet? And is this something the Tibet movement can take advantage of in these emerging situations? So maybe you could speak to that. Yeah?
Whether it's the Quad or the latest AUKUS, one thing we have to bear in mind that this is part of the broader, at least from our perspective here in Washington, D.C., the broader Biden administration effort that I outlined earlier to challenge China's assertiveness. Mm-hmm. So where there is opportunity of collaboration between like-minded countries towards achieving certain objective, the Biden administration is working with other countries, and we look at that. And so from the Tibet perspective, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act also mandates the United States administration to reach out to like-minded countries and work with them to take up the Tibetan issue in a joint way. And we feel that whether it's Quad or AUKUS, whatever it is, the United States can proactively take up the Tibetan issue. But I should also emphasize here the fact that the Tibetan leadership has from day one said that they don't want a third party interference in the dialogue process. Dialogue process can be encouraged, but eventually it is between the Tibetans and the Chinese that the issue has to be resolved.
Thank you, Bhuchung. Kai, I think we have you back online. Could you address the earlier question about do you think EU leaders will push for similar laws as the Tibet Policy and Support Act? And is this a focus also for your office?
Yes, thank you. I think one major difference between the US and Europe, and for example, if you look at member states of the EU, Germany, for example, is the fact that the Europeans are shying away by and large. There has been a development this year at the EU level, of course, but the EU has been shying away from taking consequences from human rights violations, from policy issues, of
We have some connection issues there. While we get him back, we can turn to our next question in the meantime from Julie Beer from California. And the question is Nepal still blocking the border to Tibetans? And maybe an update on Tibet situation for Tibetans in Nepal. Could I turn to you, Bhuchung?
Yeah, on the situation of Tibetans in Nepal and Nepal's policy on the Tibetan refugees that come out of Tibet. Unfortunately, since 2008, the annual flow of refugees from Tibet through Nepal to India has dwindled, and we learned that just this year there are hardly less than 6 or 7 Tibetans who have been able to come out, escape through Tibet through Nepal. That's firstly because the Chinese authorities have imposed stringent border security control measures. Secondly, because they have been pressuring Nepal to not to entertain Tibetans who come out of Tibet. And there have been cases in the past when there have been refoulement of Tibetans by Nepal. So that is the situation in terms of Tibetans coming out of Nepal. But even without Tibetans coming out of from Tibet to Nepal, there are maybe a couple of thousand Tibetans still living in Nepal who have challenges. The Nepalese authorities have at one time tried to provide them registrations which would enable them to live a wholesome life as refugees, earning their livelihood, having education, being able to work wherever they want. Unfortunately, the Nepalese authorities stopped doing so in the last several years. Therefore, Tibetans in Nepal face this situation where they don't have any documents that can enable to lead a normal life, even though many of them have been born and brought up in Nepal. So that is the current situation of Tibet and Nepal. And we have always been trying to sort of encourage the Nepalese government to look at the Tibetan people from a humanitarian perspective, including the fact that there has been a historical relationship between Tibetans and Nepalese that should encourage Nepal to sort of look sympathetically at the Tibetan people.
Very briefly, one additional remark is that ICT, with its partner FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights, has submitted a report on the situation of Tibetans in Nepal for the Universal Periodic Review of Nepal this year, and we were also just reflecting what Bhuchung said about the difficulty for Tibetans in Nepal to leave the statues and so on. So we have a recent document on it also. If some of the people watching us would like to get, we can provide it.
I think we are running at the end of our time. And one last question we have from Quick, one of our members, a volunteer who usually comes to our office all the time. We miss seeing you, Greg. But the question from Greg is, how can members be more involved? He says, of course, aware of Lobby Day, but otherwise, how can members or volunteers be more involved on Tibet? So maybe you could address that.
If I may, I think any and everything that an individual can do to spread awareness of the situation in Tibet and to see that while the Tibetan people continue to face these human rights issues, whether it's through writing blogs, social media outreach, addressing their members of parliament wherever they are, and if you are in the United States, to be part of our virtual lobby day next week, when we will have a lobby day outreach to members of Congress. These will be helpful to the Tibetan cause.
Thank you, Bhuchung. And with that, we are just about out of time. So I'll say thank you to everyone tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and learned something. I feel really grateful and lucky to be working with wise and wonderful human beings at our leadership at ICT. And I thank all three of you for joining us today. And I'm sorry we missed Tsering, but that would have been nice to have her as well. And we lost Kai at the last minute, but thank you, Kai, as well. And we'll say we'll be tuning off now. We'll be back next month with another episode of Tibet Talks on Thursday, October 14th. We'll be discussing the passage and impact of the 1991 immigration bill that brought 1,000 Tibetan refugees to the United States. It should be an interesting conversation, as we'll have guests who are some of the initial Tibetans who came as part of that program, as well as some of those who worked on that project. Don't forget, everyone, we have past Tibet Talks archived on ICT's YouTube channel and also available on podcast. You can visit safetibet.org/live to learn more, and also don't forget to join our mailing list for alerts. Thank you, finally, for your interest, dedication, and support for Tibet. The more people care about Tibet, the bigger the impact we can have. With that, until next time, please stay safe and well, and we'll be looking forward to see you. Thank you.